I went to see Milk on the big screen. The fact that Anne Cronenberg had to carry the burden of 3 or 4 or 5 or 10,000 lesbians in the state of California disturbed me at the time, but I thought I'll have to get the DVD in order to really see. When I got home, I found myself the recipient of a flood of letters, emails, telephone calls from people saying, for God's sake, have you seen Milk? They've done it again. You know, the gay brothers will just never learn. You know, they've left out all the women, and all the people who were calling and saying, you know, hey, you've got to do something about this. You're visible. Why don't you be the spokeswoman and say how terrible it is that there are, again, no women in the film of any consequence. There were actually thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of women, people who were at work, you know, against Proposition 6. I took that very seriously and talked to a number of women that I had felt were, you know, that I had known, I had worked with during that time with Harvey. And they all said, yes, Sally, do it. I said, don't we want to do a collective thing? They said, no, you do it and we'll support it. So I worked for about 4 weeks after having seen the film yet again and realized finally that I was so angry and I was so hurt and I was so emotionally disheveled by the very careful excision of any association of me with Harvey, and to some extent of Gwen Craig with Harvey. Gwen Craig was Harvey's appointee to the No on 6 headship, along with Bill Krause. Harvey, and here's the irony, Harvey was one of the most fanatic people about gender equality that I knew about, certainly at that time. He insisted that all the way down the line, with anything that he was associated with, that it be chaired by both a woman and a man. The United Fund Against the Briggs Initiative that he and I chaired was a rainbow of colors, a rainbow of class or economic, status, a rainbow of genders. Harvey was almost a fanatic about this business of having gender equality. Constantly he would talk about feminism. Constantly he would talk about the importance of showing that at last, lesbians and gay men were able to work together, because, throughout the years we had used each other as a shield against the society in order to protect ourselves. I mean, according to the people in my past, I've been engaged to at least 11 gay men, who took me to picnics and faculty parties and things like that. We used each other in those ways, but we were not really socially into each other, except, in a friendship, kind of way. We had never, ever, for heaven's sake, had to work on a political issue together. And when Proposition 6 came up, and it was clear that we had to work together because this was an issue that affected all of us. And when it became clear that Harvey and other people, but Harvey in particular, were so set on seeing to it that women were recognized, we all of us answered the call, and it is just not the case that the gay men of San Francisco fought valorously and won against Proposition 6. They didn't do it by themselves. They did it with a lot of women. Probably, maybe, I don't even want to say more, but at least as many women were involved in that campaign as otherwise. So when I began to realize that this was the case, and began to see my anger exploding in different ways, and my hurt, and my, oh golly, that same feeling of the gay guys, bless their hearts, have done it again. They just don't understand that women do exist. Somebody should remind the people of the future that women did indeed fight against and were a big part of winning against Proposition 6. Somebody needs to do it, but it can't be me. Because all I can do is either scold or whine. And my scolding and whining got to me. There was no way I felt like I could do it without just sounding even worse than perhaps I usually do. And so I turned it over, and I just said, for the first time in my life, I cannot do this thing that I have been committed to doing, because I was actually using this whole matter of trying to get it done as an excuse to feel bad. The artistic approach to the thing was so intense on making Harvey the victim of the homophobia of Dan White that everything else sort of fell by the wayside. It's artistically totally legitimate. If they had had any more women in that show, it would have detracted from the intensity of the artistic effort. That might have been true. And they were, this is not history, this is Hollywood. And if we're asking, or if we want an Academy Award or two out of it, we better not put the women in, because it'll ruin the artistry of the film. That's probably true, and if it is, then certainly they're to be commended for that, because it was certainly, Sean Penn was certainly worthy, and the writers were certainly worthy of their Academy Awards. But it left out women. Again, that's all.
Harvey asked me and my closest friend at the time, Bill Krause, to co-manage the No on 6 campaign, the campaign against Prop 6. There came to be this coalescing of lesbian women and gay men, I think like never before. And people who've been around for a lot longer than I had at the time certainly backed that up. There had to be equal partnership between men and women. Harvey had really been successful at bringing together this coalition, particularly getting union folks involved. He made a lot of those kind of political and personal connections that we were able to draw on so well. Harvey put together, for the most part, our steering committee for the No on 6 campaign. And I didn't know at first, if anybody felt like I did, how much there was something missing from the story. It took a while for me to realize how much people felt like I did, that it was not a very authentic presentation of what the community was like, what Harvey was like in some respects, and didn't show that part of the story about how there was this presence of lesbian women, not just Anne Cronenberg, but in various ways in Harvey's campaign. And Harvey was a spokesperson, but there was another person missing from the picture, who was Sally Gearhart, who together with Harvey went out to the debates, and when there were television interviews and radio interviews and all sorts of public appearances. And Sally was nowhere to be found in that story. And it really did make it seem like a very small band of predominantly men were able to pull off this phenomenal success. I think it leads people to the conclusion that doesn't tell the whole story, and it doesn't give the kind of roadmap that I hope would be given to people for future campaigns and future movement building. To know how things were really done and what it really took to bring the community together and to be successful in what we did, I think you had to know just how much women and communities of color were involved, and that's so missing from the story of the movie.
Harvey got elected. That was like a big thrill. I did not know Harvey at that time, but I was thrilled to see him being elected and, on TV and all of this. And it felt good to have a gay person in such a position of power. He was, always an extremely charming person and charismatic person. And I think that came out from the very beginning to me. The movement began to, I think, merge in several points, mostly on the, No on 6, the response to the Briggs Initiative. There were several sort of different points. The first, Sally Gearhart and Harvey Milk were the stars. They served the star role in, carrying the banner for No on 6. And they were together throughout. They faced Briggs together. What Sally said in the debates was, in my opinion, as persuasive or more persuasive than what Harvey did. The two of them were a team. And then there were the organization directors, which included Paula Lichtenberg and Priscilla Alexander, and, you know, of course, some of the men were activists as well. I think really that coming into that pivotal year, there were some men who had some very, very strong political moxie and credentials, but there were many more women who did than men. And the leadership was completely co-sexual, and women contributed vastly to what went on. And then there was the parade and celebration, which became the populist movement against the Briggs Initiative. And so it was sort of like a three-pronged strategy that came out.
In listening to you talk about Harvey Milk and your friend Sally being written out of the story, this same thing happened to my friend Poppy Northcutt. Poppy is a defense attorney in Houston, criminal defense attorney. She was prosecuted before that. Poppy is, she's very glamorous. I mean, to this day, she's got platinum blonde hair, maybe just platinum hair, but she's a good-looking woman in her, I guess she's probably in her 60s now, maybe in her 70s. You can only imagine at the time of Apollo 13, when she was the only woman in mission control, what she looked like. I mean, she was a knockout, no doubt. So Poppy, here she is the only woman in mission control, even her real life character, very glamorous. And her job at the time of Apollo 13 was to figure out the mathematical formula to bring the spaceship back after the engines failed, right? And so what she did is she figured out, you know, exactly where they had to fire the landing engines as the spacecraft went around the moon to bring it back to Earth. And she said, I knew they were coming back. They might be dead when they got back, but she said, I knew they were coming back. Okay, fast forward to whenever they made the movie Apollo 13, which I guess was in the late 90s. Ron Howard came to Houston, he talked to all those people in mission control, and he wrote her out of the movie. She was not in the movie. But I was absolutely outraged. So she said, well, maybe they wrote me out of it because I worked for the contractor. I didn't work for NASA. But you know what? I couldn't quite get there. I mean, each one of them had a job. Everyone in mission control had a job to do, whether it was to figure out how to keep them from freezing to death, how to get air to the astronauts, how to make sure they got food. Her job was very important, and that was to figure out the mathematical formula to get the spaceship back to Earth. Key role, and I was outraged. I'm still outraged that she was written out of that movie.
Well, here in San Francisco, it was very clearly Amber. You know, Amber Hallenbaugh and got some people together, and they all got in vans and they went out to, you know, the small towns, and they said, look, you know, this is crazy. You know, she's a woman with an enormous political vision. And you know, a lot of us understood that the reason that we survived that was, you know, Amber getting this gang together and going out. You know, but to your point, that's one of the things that's disappeared from history. You know, San Francisco was many San Franciscos at the same time. And, you know, there was a lot going on Castro Street, but our neighborhood was Valencia Street. You know, the lesbians didn't afford Castro Street. We afforded Valencia Street, where the rents were a little less, shall we say, and that's where we could have, you know, the Mission was where a lot of dykes lived, and it was also, it's kind of the center for political dykes. And women with, you know, certainly a lesbian vision, but also a political vision that had a lot to do with class and race and how America was run and who benefited from all these oppressions and who didn't. And Castro Street community didn't always have that wider comprehension. That's a whole history. It's about women. It was work that was focused on women, and you know, try to find that in anybody's history. And the things that were important to us were of no interest to many of them. The thing about guys is they think that they're normal and they think that they're the center of the world, and nothing, very little ever disabuses them of that sense of entitlement. And you know, as lesbians and feminists of that era, we had just had it with all of that. You know, there were certainly men who had good intention, and there were men who sometimes acted in those good intentions and principled ways. And there were a lot who didn't. And even the ones who meant well often forgot. So much of what's become the popular gay movement is really about getting, more opportunity for what oftentimes just looks like a bunch of white guys. Like, we're just about civil rights, and it's not a movement about class. The Harvey Milk film, in which somebody tell me how could they disappear Sally Gerhardt? How do you do that? How do you be a big enough force in history to make Sally disappear from that whole political campaign and that whole point in time and all of the coalition work that she did? She really put herself out there to work in coalition with the guys, and over on Valencia Street we were saying, they're so like that, and unfortunately in hindsight the history is they're so like that.
Randy Schultz wrote a book called The Mayor of Castro Street. Right. Sally was not in it at all.
No, and no women were.
No women were in that.
It
It's
an awful book.
The Life and Times of Harvey Milk, the documentary.
That film, yes, that's a good.
I was in. It was in Mission High School. They had a big auditorium. I don't know if any of you were there at the time, and they had a statewide debate, and they showed it there on the screen. And it was Harvey Milk and Sally against John Briggs and some minister. And John and Harvey kind of debated back and forth, but Sally and the minister debated. And afterwards, they came back to the auditorium and we all applauded, and Harvey said Sally won that debate. And it was that debate, as I talked to my conservative relatives in Orange County, it was Sally's debating that minister that turned that around. And Sally was It was obvious, being part of that movie, that it was Steve Jones that they depended on, and it was his story that they were telling. It wasn't part of the story. So I'm telling, especially with young people, when you see that movie, you see other movies and stuff, it's because men are writing the history.
Yeah.
We need to write our own history. Your life stories need to be told because it's for you that we are here. We deserve, I keep telling you, we owe these women our lives. We really do. Thank you.
Well, Sally herself was more centrally on the speaker circuit against the Briggs Amendment before Harvey was. And either she invited him or, he was not the first, and he certainly wasn't the only. And the time that in the movie they showed him actually debating Briggs, Sally was there. She was part of that debate. Oh, when they defeated the Briggs Amendment, I was at the celebration party in the Castro. And Harvey, and Sally were up in the front, and everybody was down, yelling and screaming at. Moscone was there too, I'm pretty sure. And Harvey, pulled Sally's hand up like the winning fighter, Sally Gerhardt for supervisor. He was trying very hard to get her. He was in the crowd holding her coat, thinking, no, don't do that. She would be terrible as a politician. She's much better on the edges of those things. But that's why two reasons. When I saw the film, it just felt surrealistically wrong to have just the boys there, just the boys. Put in Anne Cronenberg, she was an important one. And she was up for supervisor, I think it was it Diane? Who was it who got to choose whom to fill in?
It was Diane, yes. Yes.
She chose Harry Britton instead. I can't remember, there were plenty of other women involved at the time against the Briggs Initiative. It's true that Harvey himself, although he was a big guy for diversity, he was a boy's boy, and so of course his his camera shop was loaded with boys.
This was about Harvey Milk, so.
It was about Harvey Milk, but here was another one of my complaints, and that is that it's wonderful that this movie will reach a mainstream audience, but the huge majority of those people, almost all of them, for them, this is the only version of this history they're going to see. Sort of went ballistic over that.
Lesbians and gay men of my generation, post-World War II period, I think we all felt different more than anything else. You couldn't just do what was expected of you. You had to strategize all the time. You had to create a persona that could survive in a very hostile environment. You had desperately to conceal the fact that you were gay. But in my case, I've been told that I have Asperger's syndrome, and that makes sense to me. I know that I have a severe social anxiety disorder, OCD, and a pretty good catalog of symptoms. And Harvey Milk spoke to us specifically at that point, where we had experienced ourselves as weak and different, and said, look there for your power. Don't look for your ability to pass. Don't look for your ability to smile when you don't feel like smiling. Don't look for your ability to assimilate. Look at those things that you're most ashamed of and most afraid the world would find out about you, because that's where your power is. If you live out of that, if you make it visible, if you're a boy that wants to put on a dress or a girl that wants to dress up like girls aren't supposed to dress up, do it, and you'll find that the world is going to have to develop some new strategies to deal with you instead of you always having to come up with new strategies to deal with it. So I think if there's one thing Harvey on a personal level did to us, it was saying all those things you've been trying to do to get along are bullshit. You've got to quit that. Quit lying, quit creating a self that has nothing to do with your biology or your feelings or your desires or what's real about you. A lot of the people that rallied around Harvey were people who were fairly desperate. So we weren't dumb, but our whole lifestyle was pretty dumb. It was pretty dumb for us to be so dishonest and so fearful and so desperate. Harvey's great legacy was his effect on people, the changes he made in people, the empowerment of people, getting people to look at themselves in new ways and to accept responsibility for the future. A lot of us were veterans of the movements of the 60s, but for the most part had never felt totally at home in any of those movements. They seemed to me a little doctrinaire and a little unimaginative, but there was power there. And Harvey wanted those people, but he wanted them not to be following the strategies of the 60s. He wanted a strategy that was going to win, that was going to be powerful. I think the part of Harvey's work that is most underestimated is the role of the women's movement in what we were about, because the women's movement, particularly the lesbian part of the women's movement, was more radical than the gay movement, which made it harder for us to integrate smoothly. But it also provided a kind of persistence in what we were fighting for. Harvey was a star in a moment in time when grassroots activism was taking control of politics in San Francisco. Harvey was not a one-person operation. He was the leader of a movement, but you've got to be, in order to have a leader, you have to be going somewhere. You can't lead someone who's just standing still. And so we had an agenda, we had relationships, we had dreams, and we thought they were real. And Harvey was going to help us get there. But when he was murdered, we just looked around at each other and realized that, okay, it's us now.
The thing about Harvey that was also so important was the way in which he was able to respond to these kids who wrote him from all over the country in absolute despair, feeling that they were the only gay kids around, and many of them were suicidal. And Harvey's ability, his wisdom, his compassion to be able to say, to reach those kids, to be able to say just the right thing that kind of kept them on the line or kept them, you know, connected and gave them the courage and the feeling that they could take the next step, you know, that they could do what they needed to do to be able to get out of the situation they were in, you know, and thrive. I mean, what's remarkable about Harvey is that if he just took 2 steps to the left, you know, he would have been a raging queen. While having all of these very compassionate and connective instincts and awarenesses, was able to have just enough of a robust self-presentation that he became the kind of person visually that these kids from the Midwest could imagine themselves being. You know, being able to imagine themselves being that way. That was a reasonable and acceptable male way of being in the world. It was, and you know, Sally back in those days with her lipstick and her high heels and her hose, wow, she could walk across the stage. And that's the other point, Carla, when you leave out women,
you leave out the feminine.
You leave out hunks and hunks of men. I mean, this is what men need to get, you know? And this is what we were so afraid to talk about in the early part of the women's movement, because we were just so eager to talk about women, and we didn't want to talk about men's oppression. We didn't want to talk about the way patriarchy hurt men, and I understand why we didn't, but it doesn't mean it doesn't. Patriarchy slaughters men and turns them, you know, into shards of human beings, which is why they do such crazy things.
Okay, you like the image of the coalition building. That's an identity issue, because the way we're framing coalition building is not the mechanics of building a coalition. We're at the moment framing the identity of the person who has the capacity to do it. And it is truly true that Sally and Harvey were able to do that, unlike many of their peers. And at a point in time together, they created the kind of synergy that made a whole thing happen. It would never have occurred to Sally to answer the letter of someone who was struggling to find their identity.
Right.
Period.
Right.
She was so eroticized, Carla, that it was impossible to get anything that one might have wanted from Sally. You had to have a sexual relationship with her.
In order to have any relationship at all.
That's
Right, and it didn't last long. It was very intense. It was quite a hot ride.
The exception were the guys, right? The exception would be like Ron Hahnemann. You know, he and Sally could pour over those triple circles, you know, over, you know, the Music Man until all hours of day and night, you know, and could be very close because it wasn't an issue. It doesn't escape me for a minute, Carla, and it actually breaks my heart to watch you have been willing to stay with Sally all these years and have actually done some of the, I mean, I think what's going to turn out to be the most important thing about her life, and that's what you did in Oregon. And it has to do with these 2 coalition personalities, these 2 unique human beings, you know, who were able to walk over numerous bridges and make connections with people that other people couldn't make connections with. And so, you know, now you've got kind of where you're headed. It has to involve Sally's omission from the Milk film. I mean, that, you know, that has to be kind of the middle part of the story, or the kind of the middle to the end part of the story of these 2 radiant, androgynous, unusual people. Harvey just man enough, Sally just woman enough, and yet, you know, this radiant humanness, this androgyny that comes out of both of those faces. You know, this is what people look like who are capable of living in the 21st century and building the much more complex societies that we need to build.
And, you know, sex is a piece of that, but the reality of it is you were seeing somebody who was interestingly complex, to a large extent high camp at that point, but also non-gendered. And every instinct you had was here was somebody who understood gender as defense, and as mask and as hiding, I mean, all these things. And you saw somebody who was really strong. I mean, you had a PhD who was teaching. You know, so to the young person, you were seeing a vision of what you could be. And when we're young, it gets all confused with what we're trying to be ourselves. So the film makes really good sense to me if you frame it with you and Sally in the beginning, and end it with somebody, as Dorothy is saying, with this vision of two human beings, a male and a female, who were able to accomplish a good deal in the world, in large part because they weren't ordinary. In the very same way that you're not ordinary. And that ability to build coalitions comes a lot easier to a lot of us who don't have a firm identity that's one thing, which is always enforced. I mean, I can be almost anything to anybody I have to be if my survival depends on it.